Hello and welcome back to another evening together, wherever you are right now, tucked in, lights low, maybe the ceiling fan doing its quiet thing overhead. I'm glad you're here. Get comfortable. We've got a long one tonight, and that's very much the point. So, Dexter Morgan, if you've spent any amount of time on this channel, you already know that we take the show seriously around here. Not in a stiff, academic way, not in the way that drains all the fun out of it, just in the way that anything you genuinely love deserves, which is a close, unhurried look. The kind of look you can only really give something late at night when there's nowhere to be and no reason to rush. Tonight's topic has been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, and I want to be clear about what it is and what it isn't before we get into it. This isn't a criticism of the show. I don't say that as a disclaimer. I say it because it's genuinely true. What we're talking about tonight is one of the most interesting things Dexter does across its entire run, and I think it's one of the things it does best, even if it never quite comes out and admits it's doing it. Here's the thing, Dexter Morgan is, by almost any reasonable definition, an addict. Not metaphorically, not loosely. The show uses the actual language of addiction to describe his compulsion. He has cravings, he has rituals, he has a need that overrides everything else when it gets loud enough. He structures his entire life around managing that need. He goes to Narcotics Anonymous meetings for most of season 2. And the running joke, except it isn't really a joke, is that the cover story he uses at those meetings is more accurate than anyone in the room realizes. That's what tonight's about. Not just the NA storyline, though we'll spend a good while there. It's about the whole framework the show builds around Dexter's compulsion, the dark passenger, Harry's code, the people who get pulled into his orbit and end up shaped and in some cases destroyed by proximity to his need. Deborah, Rita, Harrison. The way the show uses the architecture of addiction, the craving, the ritual, the management strategy, the collateral damage, to tell a story about someone it can't describe in any other terms. Because here's what I've always found interesting if you've watched the show as many times as I have. Dexter never gets better. That's not a criticism, that's a deliberate choice. He doesn't recover, he manages. And the code, that elegant set of rules Harry gave him, isn't a cure, it's harm reduction. It's the show saying, we know this person isn't going to stop, so let's at least make sure the damage stays inside certain lines. That's a specific and somewhat sophisticated position for a Showtime drama to take, and I think it's worth sitting with for a couple of hours tonight. We'll go roughly in order through the series, though we'll drift thematically in places because that's where the interesting connections are. We'll talk about season 2 at length because that's where the addiction framing is most explicit. We'll talk about what the dark passenger actually is and what Harry's dialogue about it in season 7 implies. We'll spend time with Rita and with Deb and with Harrison in New Blood. And we'll end somewhere philosophical the way we always do. If you're new here, hello, welcome, very glad you found us. These long-form evenings take a while to put together, and they're made for people who want to sit with something rather than skim through it. There's a subscribe button somewhere on your screen if you'd like to catch the next one. No pressure. If you've been here before, you already know what the evenings are like. Settle in. One last thing before we start properly. We're going to be talking about the show across its full run tonight. Original series, New Blood, and a couple of gestures toward Dexter, Original Sin where it's relevant. If you haven't seen all of it, there are spoilers throughout, and fairly significant ones in places. The whole point of this kind of video is that you've lived with the show long enough to want to look at it closely. So, lights down, get comfortable. Tonight's the night we talk about Dexter Morgan's addiction, his real one. Let me back up, because to understand how the addiction framing works across the whole series, you need to understand how it started. And it started with a shoe. Season 1, fairly late in the run. Paul Bennett, Rita's ex-husband, a man the show has established as a genuine, documented addict with a history of violence, has been telling Rita that Dexter attacked him and loaded him up with drugs, which is, to be fair to Paul, entirely true. Dexter did knock him out. Dexter did access the evidence locker and steal heroin. Dexter dosed Paul with it quite deliberately because Paul was a threat to Rita and the children, and removing that threat was the most efficient thing Dexter could think to do. Paul is telling the truth. He just has absolutely no credibility left because of his history, and nobody is going to believe him. Except Rita believes him enough to confront Dexter about it. She puts Paul's shoe on the table. There's a detail in there about how Dexter had put Paul's shoe on the wrong foot when he staged the scene, which is the kind of thing that would unravel most carefully constructed lies. And she asks Dexter very directly if he attacked Paul. Dexter admits it. She asks where he got the drugs. He tells her he stole them from the evidence locker. And then Rita, doing exactly what you would do if you had lived through years of an addict's behavior and had developed very finely tuned instincts about this kind of thing, asks the question that opens the whole second season. Is Dexter an addict? Is that why he disappears at all hours? Is that what this is? And Dexter says yes. He says yes because it works. It explains the disappearances. It explains the strange hours and the evasiveness and the way he sometimes zones out in the middle of a conversation and comes back looking like he's been somewhere far away. It gives Rita a framework she already understands. She has lived inside the shape of an addict's life. She knows what it costs. She knows what the admission, "I have a problem," is supposed to mean. And she responds to it with warmth and relief rather than fury. Because for Rita, an addict who admits it is infinitely better than a man who admits nothing. Rita vows to help him beat his addiction. Dexter looks appropriately humbled and grateful. The scene moves on. Now here's what I've always found genuinely interesting about this moment, and it's something I think the show might be doing more consciously than it appears. Rita spent years with Paul. Years. She would have developed very specific instincts about what an addict looks and sounds like. The physical tells, the behavioral patterns, the particular flavor of dishonesty that addiction produces. And Dexter, by this point, shows none of the physical signs. He's not in withdrawal. He doesn't have track marks. He doesn't cycle through the moods of someone actively using or actively not using. He functions in his daily life with an unsettling steadiness. You could argue that Rita interprets this through the lens of early-stage addiction or as someone who is in denial about the extent of his use. And there's something to that reading. But I think what's actually happening is something more interesting. The show is letting the cover story work because the emotional architecture underneath it is true. Dexter does disappear at strange hours. He does have cravings he cannot explain to anyone around him. He does organize his entire existence around managing a need that other people cannot see. He does have a ritual. He does have a cycle of craving and satisfaction and relief. He does experience something in the aftermath of a kill that functions emotionally the way a hit functions. Rita doesn't know the noun. She thinks the noun is heroin. The noun is actually something much darker and much harder to treat. But the shape of the thing she recognizes, the shape of a person whose life is secretly organized around a need they can't put down, that shape is accurate. She just happens to be better at reading it than she knows. There's also something worth sitting with in Rita's specific emotional response. She's relieved, not angry or not primarily angry. Relieved. And I think that tells you something about what an addict's family member sometimes feels when the secret finally comes out. It's not that the truth is good news, it's that having a name for the thing is better than not having one. The unknown is harder to live with than the known, even when the known is bad. Rita now has a category for Dexter. She has a path she recognizes: admission, program, recovery, support. She knows how to be in that story because she has been in that story before. The irony, of course, is that Dexter is going to spend season 2 attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings for a drug problem he doesn't have, while the actual thing that's eating him alive sits just below the surface. He will give the most honest speech of his entire life inside that NA meeting room. He will describe his compulsion in terms that are completely accurate. He will make the room feel something real, and every word will technically be about something else. It's a neat trick. And I don't think it's an accident. The show set this up deliberately. It knew what the NA storyline was actually doing, even if it never announces it plainly. One more thing about this sequence that I think deserves attention: the heroin. Dexter's explanation to Rita is that he knows how to cook it, knows how to dose it, because he is an addict. And Rita accepts this. What the show doesn't dwell on is how specific that knowledge actually is. Dexter didn't just have heroin lying around. He stole it from the evidence locker. He knows the chemistry well enough to reconstitute it and dose a grown man without killing him. These are not skills that belong to a casual user. In any real conversation about addiction, a clinician or a sponsor or anyone familiar with the territory would find this level of technical knowledge at least worth noting. But Rita doesn't push on it. She doesn't push on it because she wants the admission more than she wants the details. And that's completely human. That's exactly what grief and relief and hope do to the interrogating instinct. They soften it at the exact moment you most need it sharp. Rita has her answer. Dexter has his cover. The show moves forward. What lingers if you let it is the quiet accuracy of everything Dexter has admitted. He has a problem he cannot stop. He disappears at night. He lies about where he goes. He is entirely, completely controlled by something he cannot share with the person who loves him. Every word of that is true. The word heroin is doing all the deflection work while every other part of the confession stands unmodified. The lie that told the truth. That's where season 2 begins. There's one more angle on the season 1 confession worth exploring, because I think it reframes something about Dexter's psychology that the show returns to consistently. When Dexter says yes to Rita's question, he doesn't hesitate. There's no visible internal calculation in the scene. He doesn't pause and weigh his options the way he usually does when a situation requires navigation. He just says it. I've always thought that speed is significant. The answer comes quickly, not because Dexter prepared it in advance. He didn't know Rita was about to ask, but because some part of him already knows the answer is yes. He is, in some genuine sense, relieved by the question. Not because the NA cover story is a comfortable one, but because being asked, "Are you an addict?" and being able to say yes is the first time in his life that someone has looked at him and offered a category that fits. An incomplete category, a wrong noun category, but something that has the right shape. Most of Dexter's social interactions require him to perform normalcy from scratch, to manufacture appropriate responses, to observe what the people around him are doing and calibrate accordingly. He is, as the show takes pains to establish, deeply skilled at this. It's what makes him effective at his forensics work, what makes him readable as a colleague and a boyfriend and a father. But it's performance all the way down. There's no category in ordinary social life that accommodates what he actually is. Addict comes the closest. It's the category that says, this person has a compulsion they didn't choose, that shapes their behavior in ways they can't fully control, that requires management rather than elimination, that coexists with genuine care for other people and genuine desire to function in the world. That's not quite Dexter's story, but it's much closer to Dexter's story than anything else on offer. So when Rita asks and the answer comes quickly, I read it as the compressed relief of someone who has been waiting a long time for a question they can almost honestly answer. He can't say the true thing. He can say the closest available thing. And in that moment, on Rita's sofa, with the shoe on the table and the conversation turning towards something real, the closest available thing is enough. It doesn't last. It can't. The cover story works for a season, phrase gets complicated by Lila and Dokes and the FBI investigation, and eventually dissolves entirely into something much harder to manage. But the moment of the yes itself, that quiet, quick, almost grateful yes, that moment is Dexter doing the most honest thing he's ever done in a relationship, even if the honesty is aimed at the wrong target. Season 2 then, which is where the addiction framing stops being background noise and becomes the entire season-long structure. The setup is this. Dexter's underwater body dump has been discovered by divers. 18 bags of dismembered victims pulled up from the floor of the bay. The FBI has been called in. A task force is forming. The city is looking for whoever they're now calling the Bay Harbor Butcher. And the investigation is close enough to Dexter's life that he can hear it breathing. Meanwhile, Rita, who has known since the end of season 1 that Dexter admitted to being an addict, wants him working a program. She wants the newcomer's chip. She wants him going to meetings. And because Dexter needs her, needs the cover she provides, needs the version of himself that exists inside her house and her children's routines and her very normal Florida life, he agrees. He shows up to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting and sits in the back row. He is profoundly bored. He inspects the donuts. He thinks about knife sharpening. Caroline at the front of the room is sharing something genuinely painful, and Dexter is miles away, cataloging his own internal schedule with the quiet efficiency of a man who has never once had to sit still in a room and feel something he didn't choose to feel. He leaves without the newcomer's chip. Rita is disappointed but patient. He promises to go back, and here's the thing. He does go back. He keeps going back throughout the season. And somewhere in those meetings, something unexpected starts happening. Not recovery exactly, not even the beginning of it. But something shifts, just slightly, in Dexter's relationship with what he's doing. There's a scene a few episodes in where Dexter shares at a meeting for the first time. Not performing, not calculating an angle, just talking with his actual name about something that is actually true. He tells the group that there is something dark inside him, that when it's driving, he feels alive, that he wonders sometimes if anything else could love him, that he's scared by the feeling of connection, by the fact that there might be someone in his life, Rita, the children, who he genuinely doesn't want to lose. The room applauds. Lila from across the room is watching him with the focused attention of someone who has just recognized something. And then Dokes walks in. Dokes, who has been following Dexter for months, who knows that something is wrong even if he can't name what, who has been treating Dexter's evasiveness as the behavior of a suspect rather than a colleague. Dokes watches Dexter at an NA meeting and relaxes. He approaches Dexter afterward and tells him that his strange behavior finally makes sense. Lots of cops turn to drugs and alcohol. Dokes tells Dexter to stay clean and stay out of his way. He mentions that Dexter owes him a new tire, and then he leaves. Think about that for a second. Dokes, of all people, the one person at Miami Metro who has looked at Dexter most closely and felt something wrong. And the NA meeting dissolves his suspicion almost entirely because an addict in recovery is a category he can understand. It gives the behavior a container. It turns the uncanny stillness of Dexter Morgan into something with a name. The NA meeting is doing the same thing for Dokes that it did for Rita. It's providing a framework that is almost right. The compulsion is real. The secrecy is real. The double life is real. The framework that misnames it is doing exactly what the show needs it to do. It's keeping everyone around Dexter at 1 degree of remove from the actual truth. But I keep coming back to what Dexter says in that meeting room, because it's worth reading carefully. He says there's something dark inside him that makes him feel alive when it drives. He says he wonders if it's just the addiction telling him nothing else can love him. He says he is scared by feeling something for another person. None of that is a lie. Every word of it is accurate. The NA setting just provides a translation layer. The listeners hear a drug addict describing his compulsion and his fear of intimacy, which is a story they know. What Dexter is actually describing is something far more specific and far more irreversible. One more thing about the meetings, and then we'll move to the person who came out of them. The show is careful not to play the NA scenes purely for dramatic irony. As in, look at this killer pretending to be an addict, how absurd. There's a genuine discomfort in them that I think is intentional. Dexter sits in those rooms with people who are fighting something real, and the show allows their stories to land on him even when he doesn't want them to. He doesn't sob, he doesn't have a Hollywood epiphany, but he listens. And the voiceover that runs through these scenes isn't contemptuous. It's curious. Dexter is genuinely trying to figure out if any of this applies to him. If the language these people are using maps onto the thing he's carrying, it does. That's the quiet argument the show is making. The language fits. The meetings just have the wrong noun in the middle of them. There's a moment in season 2 that connects to all of this in a way I want to name before we move on. The Dark Defender episode, season 2, episode 5, has Dexter falling asleep at an NA meeting and dreaming about his mother's death. In the dream, he enters the cargo container where she was murdered dressed in a vigilante's cloak. He beats the killers down. He saves her. He wakes up and tells Lila about the dream. She interprets it as something he needs to pursue. She tells him he must confront his mother's killers to find closure. What I find interesting about this scene is that it happens inside an NA meeting. Dexter is literally at a Narcotics Anonymous session, working his fake recovery program when he drifts into a dream about the trauma that shaped his compulsion. The show is overlapping the recovery framework and the origin story in the same space. The NA meeting isn't just cover, it's functioning almost against Dexter's will as the closest thing he's ever had to actual therapeutic proximity to his own wounds. He doesn't want this, he's bored, he's running out the clock. And yet the room's atmosphere, the act of sitting in a space where people are encouraged to be honest about the dark parts of themselves, is doing something to him. It's opening a door he normally keeps very firmly shut. Not enough to change anything, but enough to produce the dream, enough to let the container in. The meetings are doing something, just not what they're supposed to be doing, or maybe exactly what they're supposed to be doing, for someone who's never had any other route to the thing that shaped him. There's also the broader social effect of the NA cover story that's worth thinking about because it changes more than just Rita's understanding. Dexter at NA is Dexter performing vulnerability in public. He has never done this. The entire structure of his life is built on concealment, on managing what the outside world perceives of him. The NA meetings require a different posture. They require the outward shape of openness. And Dexter, who is quite intelligent about reading what's needed in a social situation, learns to do this well enough that it convinces people. The effect on Dokes is the most striking and I think the most revealing. Dokes has spent an entire season following Dexter, tracking his behavior, convinced at a deep instinctual level that something is profoundly wrong. And then he sees Dexter at the NA meeting. And he relaxes, not because the evidence has changed, because the framework has. An addict in recovery is a comprehensible human story. It gives Dexter's strangeness a container that Dokes can process and move past. Dokes even shows warmth briefly. He tells Dexter to stay clean and they won't have a problem. He leaves with a joke about a tire. The man who was closest to seeing Dexter clearly gets pushed back by a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. That's extraordinary when you sit with it. It works not because Dexter is a brilliant liar, he is, but that's not the operative mechanism here. But because the human mind is good at slotting ambiguous behavior into familiar patterns once a familiar pattern is offered. Dokes had an anomaly. The NA story turned the anomaly into a recognizable type. The cognitive relief of that is enormous, and the show understands it exactly. Season 2 would be a much shorter season if Dokes hadn't found that relief. The person who comes out of those meetings is Lila Tournay. And Lila is, depending on your reading of her, either the most dangerous character in Season 2 or the most honest one. Possibly both. She spots Dexter at his very first NA meeting, checks him out from across the room while Caroline is sharing. There's something immediately off-key about Lila. Not that she's unpleasant, she's actually quite compelling. But the attentiveness she directs at Dexter doesn't feel like the interest of someone who wants to help. It feels like the interest of someone who has found something they want to study. She becomes his sponsor. Her method, the thing she pitches Dexter as the work they'll do together, is not the standard 12-step framework. Lila's approach is more archaeological. She wants to dig down to the real thing, find the original wound. Don't look away from the darkness, bring it up to the surface and sit with it. Which on paper sounds like genuinely serious psychological work. And it is. That's what makes Lila such an effective character. Her insight is real. Her methods are real. The problem is that she is using the framework of recovery not to help Dexter get better, but to get closer to what he is. There's a moment in one of their early sessions where Dexter is trying to explain what the darkness feels like. It's part of who I am, he tells her. And Lila, instead of helping him examine that, leans into it. She tells him she'll help him understand his deepest, darkest secrets, help him handle his urges. She wants him to embrace it, essentially, rather than manage it, which is not what a sponsor is supposed to do. A sponsor is supposed to help you put the thing down. Lila keeps handing it back to him. I've always thought of Lila as what happens when you give a dangerous person a therapeutic vocabulary. She uses all the right language, acceptance, authenticity, getting to the truth of yourself. But she's applying these tools in service of something that has nothing to do with Dexter's well-being. She wants to know what he is because she is, in her own way, just as empty as he is. And she has spent her life using recovery spaces to find people who might fill that emptiness. The aquarium scene at the end of season 2 makes this explicit in the most economical way the show ever manages. Dexter has already decided to kill her. He meets her there to lead her into a false plan, and in the middle of it, he tells her exactly who she is. He says she knows the dictionary definition of emotions, longing, joy, sorrow, but has no idea what any of them actually feel like. She uses the right words, she pantomimes the right behavior, but the feelings never come to pass. He says he's just like her, she denies it, but she can't mount a real argument against it because it's true. What Dexter has done, without quite realizing it until that moment, is used the vocabulary of the recovery program he's been pretending to attend to accurately diagnose his own sponsor. It's a strange kind of irony. The fake addict is the one who can see clearly what the recovery veteran actually is. Lila accumulated the language of recovery without its substance. She's fluent in the vocabulary of healing and completely untouched by the thing it describes. And here's where the season 2 sponsor relationship connects to the broader addiction argument the show is building. In actual recovery, and I'm not an expert on this, I'll say that up front, the sponsor relationship is supposed to work in a specific direction. The sponsor has done the work. They've been through the process. They help guide someone else through it from a position of genuine experience. What Lila offers Dexter is the opposite of that. She is more lost than he is, and she is using his willingness to be guided as a way to get access to something she wants. The result by the end of season 2 is that Lila has burned her own loft for attention, framed Dokes, gotten a genuine and dedicated police officer killed, kidnapped 2 children, nearly burned them alive, and had to be followed to Paris and killed before she could do any further damage. None of those things are the actions of someone who's getting better. They are the escalating actions of someone whose compulsion is being enabled rather than treated. In any real NA chapter, a sponsor like Lila would be identified and removed fairly quickly. In Dexter's life, she has access for the better part of a season because the NA framework gives her cover the same way it gives Dexter cover. Recovery is a space where you're expected to be honest about the dark parts of yourself. It's a space where the dark admission is the point. For Dexter, that's useful because his real admission would end his life. For Lila, it's useful because it gives her access to people she would otherwise have no way to reach. The show never quite says this, but it's there in the architecture of season 2. The NA meetings are simultaneously the most honest space Dexter occupies and the most dangerous because they attract Lila. One more thing about Lila that I think the show gets exactly right. There's a moment midway through season 2 where Dexter starts to genuinely suspect that the fire at Lila's loft was not accidental. He looks around the apartment while helping her clean up and clocks multiple points of origin. The fire had structure. The fire was intentional. And his reaction, rather than the alarm you'd expect from someone who has just realized their sponsor committed arson, is almost a kind of fascination. He's fascinated because she takes things into her own hands. That's how the voiceover frames it. He admires the practicality of it. She had a problem. She solved it aggressively. She didn't ask permission, which is obviously a description of how Dexter operates. And that admiration is exactly the danger. Dexter is drawn to Lila partly because she reflects something back at him that he usually only sees in himself. The show is quite deliberate about this. Lila is constructed as a dark mirror, not identical to Dexter, not a killer in the same sense, but someone who operates with the same fundamental disregard for the constraints that bind other people. She burns things, she drugs people, she manipulates without apparent guilt. She is emotional to a degree that Dexter isn't, but the emotional intensity is itself manipulative, performed in the service of getting what she wants rather than felt in any straightforward way. By the end of the season, when Dexter tells her that she knows the dictionary definition of feelings but can't hear the music, you wonder how long he's known that and how long he decided it didn't matter. Because it didn't matter to him for most of the season. What Lila offered Dexter, in her broken way, was someone who could sit beside the dark parts of him without running. Someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who found the darkness interesting rather than threatening. And Dexter, who has never had that, responds to it in spite of himself, in spite of Rita, in spite of everything he knows about what Lila actually is. The enabling goes both ways. Dexter's willingness to be known, even partially, even through a fiction, enables Lila's worst behavior because her worst behavior is what she does when she gets close to something she wants. She follows him to Paris in the end, after the children and the fire and the death she caused, and Dexter follows her there and kills her. It is, in the structure of the season, the moment when the false recovery finally ends and the real compulsion acts without any NA framework around it. The cover story is fully dissolved. What remains is Dexter doing what Dexter does in an apartment in Paris with someone who understood him better than almost anyone and used it as a weapon. Since we're talking about how the show frames Dexter's compulsion, let's spend some time with the term that carries most of that weight across the series. The dark passenger. It's one of those phrases that becomes so embedded in the show's vocabulary that after a while you stop interrogating it. Dark passenger. It's what Dexter calls the need to kill. The thing that drives when it drives. The thing that he feels alive inside when it's active and hollow when it's not. It becomes the show's shorthand for his compulsion, his identity, his entire inner life. It shows up in the opening title sequence. It becomes a cultural reference point outside the show. Dark passenger. We all know what it means. Here's a fun detail, though, that the show buries in a season 7 inner monologue and then mostly moves past. Dexter didn't get the term from Harry. He thinks he did. I thought I got it from you, he tells the internal Harry voice. But Harry corrects him. Harry gave him the code. The dark passenger was Dexter's. It came from somewhere inside him when he was around 12 years old. And Harry just let it stand because he couldn't figure out how to address it without making things worse. The conversation that follows is one of the more quietly significant ones the show ever stages. Harry tells Dexter that the dark passenger isn't what he thinks it is. He says he didn't mean that Dexter was possessed when he talked about the traumatic origins of his behavior. He meant that Dexter was traumatized. The dark passenger is a feeling, Harry says, not a separate entity. There's a line from that conversation that I keep coming back to. If there's no dark passenger, then I'm responsible for everything I've done. There it is. That's the thing that has been underneath all of it. The dark passenger is not just a colorful name for a compulsion. It's a psychological mechanism. It's the way a person creates distance between themselves and the thing they do. Not by denying that they do it, but by making the doing feel like it comes from somewhere other than their own will. The dark passenger drives, Dexter's in the car. That separation, however thin, however obviously constructed, is the thing that lets him live with himself. In the addiction literature, this kind of externalization is very well documented. It's the process by which people come to speak about their addiction as a separate self. The addict in me, the disease, my addiction talking. And there are genuine reasons this framework can be useful. It creates a gap between the person and the behavior that makes change feel possible. It says, the thing doing this is not the whole of who you are. There is a you that exists outside the compulsion. The problem, as Harry points out to Dexter, is that it can also be a way of never taking the inventory. If the dark passenger's doing it, Dexter doesn't have to ask what Dexter wants. He doesn't have to look at 20-odd seasons of choosing to kill people and ask whether the choosing part was always in his hands. Hannah McKay in season 7 makes the same argument from a different direction and with less patience for the metaphysical framing. She doesn't call it a dark rider or a dark passenger or anything. She just says, fairly plainly, Dexter wants the arsonist dead. That's him. That's just him. He's not a puppet. He has a choice. Dexter pushes back. He insists it's different. She finds this unconvincing and says so. Their argument doesn't resolve, which I think is the point. The show puts both positions on the table and doesn't declare a winner. Hannah, the one who owns her choices completely, is also a killer. She says she follows through and she doesn't have a dark passenger, which is true and also slightly beside the point because what she's describing as a free choice produces the same bodies. The dark passenger framework and the pure agency framework lead to identical outcomes. Neither of them is obviously healthier. But there's something different about what they each cost the person carrying them. Dexter's externalization makes him feel less culpable, which means it also makes genuine change feel less urgent. If the dark passenger is the problem, then Dexter is the passenger, and passengers can't reroute. Hannah's framework, this is just me, I choose this, carries more responsibility but also more dignity. She doesn't need a mythology around it. She's not haunted by a passenger. She just is what she is. The show doesn't settle this question. It can't, really, without dismantling the character. But it asks it clearly in season 7, which is more than most shows would do with their protagonist's central psychological mechanism. It puts Harry in a vision sequence and lets Harry say, the dark passenger is simpler than the truth. It's a whole lot easier to blame something else. That, I think, is the most honest thing the show says about the addiction framework it's been using all along. The framework is real, the compulsion is real. But the specific mechanism of externalization, the idea that something else is driving, is a story Dexter tells himself. It's the story that lets him keep going, and the show, from season 7 onwards, knows it and says so carefully in the middle of a different plot entirely. And while we're here talking about the specific mechanics of Dexter's compulsion, I want to spend a moment on the Bloodslides, because they're one of the most precise things the show does in terms of the addiction metaphor, and they don't get discussed in those terms very often. After each kill, Dexter takes a blood sample from the victim. He slides it onto a glass microscope slide. He seals it in a small wooden box, a trophy box, which he keeps hidden in his air conditioning unit. Each slide is a memento, a marker of the compulsion exercised, the ritual completed, the need satisfied. The ritual aspect of this is worth sitting with. Addiction, at its most entrenched, doesn't just produce cravings, it produces ceremonies. The ritual of use, the preparation, the execution, the aftermath, becomes almost as important as the using itself. It gives the compulsion shape and sequence. It turns something chaotic and urgent into something with a beginning, middle, and end. Dexter's kills are the most ritualized behavior in the show. The plastic wrap, the photographs, the setup, the moment before, the blood slide, the disposal, the drive home. Each step is part of the ceremony, and the ceremony is what makes the whole thing manageable rather than consuming. The box is the physical artifact of that ceremony. It's the evidence kept close. And here's where it becomes interesting from an addiction standpoint. In season 2, when Dokes finds the box and Dexter has to scramble to contain the damage, the threat isn't just that the physical evidence will be traced. It's that the ritual has been interrupted, that someone has touched the artifact that carries the whole structure of the compulsion. The box is not just evidence of Dexter's guilt, it's the physical embodiment of the management system. It represents every moment when the code held and the need was satisfied and the ceremony completed. Losing the box or having someone else handle it is a kind of violation of the ritual itself. The show understands this. Dexter's relationship to the slides is not merely practical, it's devotional. He checks them, he keeps them close. When Dokes eventually hands them over as part of the investigation and they end up implicating him in the Bay Harbor butcher case, the slides do exactly what artifacts of a secret life always eventually do. They outlast the management system's ability to contain them. They become the evidence of the thing you most needed to hide. There's a detail later in the series, season 7, I think, where it emerges that Dexter has been keeping the Bloodslides throughout all the seasons, and the question of what to do with them becomes urgent as Lagerda's investigation closes in. At one point, the slides are in the possession of other people, and Dexter's level of anxiety about their location is disproportionate, or seems disproportionate, until you remember what they actually are. They're not just forensic evidence, they're the physical record of every moment when the code worked, every completed kill, every instance of the ceremony running from beginning to end without interruption. Losing the slides wouldn't just expose Dexter, it would undo something. It would take the structure of all those managed kills and turn them into chaos, into undifferentiated evidence of harm with no ceremony attached. The slides are the ceremony's receipt. They say this was done correctly, the code held. The need was met within the rules. That ledger matters to Dexter in a way that's hard to fully explain without the addiction framework. He's not just protecting himself legally, he's protecting the record of his management. There's a parallel here with how people in recovery keep chips, medallions, certificates of time, physical markers of the management system holding. The object is proof that the structure held, that the need was managed rather than acted on. Dexter's Bloodslides are the inverse of that. They mark when the code permitted action rather than restraint, but they serve the same function. Proof that the system is real, that it all means something and adds up to something. And when they're at risk, the system feels at risk. That's not an accident of plotting. That's the show understanding, at the level of story mechanics, what the slides actually are to Dexter Morgan. Now, talking a bit about Harry Morgan, because I think Harry is the most underrated figure in the addiction argument the show is building, and he's worth spending some real time with. Harry didn't try to fix Dexter. That's the first thing to understand. And it's the thing that makes him genuinely interesting rather than just a good father figure in flashback form. He observed what Dexter was becoming, the animal cruelty, the controlled watching, the specific pleasure he seemed to take in things that disturbed everyone around him. And he made a decision. Not the decision of a therapist or a recovery counselor or anyone working within the frameworks we've been talking about. He made the decision of a man who loved a child he couldn't cure. He gave him the code. The code, for anyone who needs a brief reminder, is a set of rules Harry and Dexter developed together over Dexter's adolescence, later revealed to have been co-designed with a neuropsychiatrist named Dr. Evelyn Vogel. You only kill people who deserve it. You confirm guilt before acting. You never kill an innocent. You don't get caught. You leave no evidence. Most of us have these memorized at this point, which says something about how much time we've collectively spent with this show. It's structured, methodical, and almost formal. A framework not for stopping the behavior, but for containing it. For making sure that the damage stays inside certain lines. In the world of addiction medicine, this approach has a specific name, harm reduction, and it's worth knowing a little bit about what that term actually means in practice, because it maps onto what Harry built for Dexter with surprising precision. Harm reduction, as a philosophy, starts from the acknowledgement that some people are going to continue a behavior regardless of intervention. That demanding total abstinence as the only acceptable outcome ignores the reality of how compulsion actually works. The harm reduction model says if we can't stop it, we can at least make it less destructive. We can keep the person safer, we can keep the people around them safer, we can minimize the collateral damage while we work on the longer-term problem, if there is a longer-term problem to work on. Harry looked at Dexter and concluded, perhaps with some help from Vogel's clinical framing, that abstinence wasn't achievable. Dexter had already killed a man by the time Harry fully understood what was happening. The compulsion was already formed. The question wasn't how to make Dexter someone who didn't feel this way. It was how to make the feeling manageable. The code is the harm reduction protocol for a serial killer. That's what it is. It doesn't stop the kills, it directs them. Dr. Vogel, who arrives in season 8 and turns out to be the person who worked with Harry to design the code, frames Harry's decision explicitly in her conversations with Deb. She argues that Harry did the right thing. He didn't lock Dexter away, he didn't do nothing and wait for an innocent person to be killed. He gave Dexter a structure, a set of rules that channel the compulsion rather than suppress it. She calls this not just acceptable, but actually ingenious, a creative response to an extraordinary situation. Deb doesn't agree. Deb, by season 8, is in a place where she thinks the entire project was a catastrophic mistake from the beginning. And honestly, given what the code has cost her personally, that's a reasonable position. But the show holds both views simultaneously rather than declaring one of them correct. What makes Harry's choice particularly interesting is what it cost him personally. He watched Dexter kill someone he had been surveilling, a real kill, not a hypothetical. And the weight of what he had helped create broke him. The architect of the harm reduction framework couldn't live with the proof of its application. He had built a protocol for something he had spent years telling himself might never be necessary. And then he saw it was necessary, and then he died. There's something genuinely painful in that. Harry loved Dexter. He built the code out of love, however confused and however complicated. He believed, or needed to believe, that giving Dexter a structured outlet was better than leaving him without one. And he was probably right on the specific question of what would have happened to Dexter without the code. But he wasn't built to live alongside the knowledge of what he'd helped Dexter become. The harm reduction model worked for Dexter. It destroyed the person who designed it. I've always found this detail important because it complicates the rehabilitation of Harry that the show sometimes leans toward. He's depicted warmly mostly. He's the good father, the man who tried, the person who loved Dexter despite understanding what he was. And all of that is true, but he also built a system that produced consequences he couldn't endure. The code contains Dexter's compulsion. It does not prevent it. And Harry, in the end, was not able to carry the distinction between those two things. There's something worth adding about Vogel here, because her arrival in season 8 reframes everything we thought we understood about the code's origins, and not entirely in a comfortable direction. Vogel is a neuropsychiatrist who specializes in psychopaths. That's her professional identity. And her interest in Dexter is partly compassionate and partly clinical, in a way that the show allows to coexist without quite resolving. She helped Harry design the code. She provides Dexter with an intellectual framework for understanding himself. Her argument that psychopaths are a necessary part of the human social ecosystem, that they serve a function, that Dexter is not broken but simply different, is delivered with genuine warmth. She calls him her perfect psychopath. She finds him fascinating in the way that someone who has dedicated their professional life to understanding a thing finds an extraordinary example of it fascinating. But, and this is important, Vogel is also using Dexter. She needs him to track the brain surgeon, a former patient of hers whose escalating violence is a threat to her and to the secrets buried in her case files. She is not purely a benefactor. She has an agenda that runs alongside her care for Dexter and occasionally competes with it. The person who designed the management system is, in season 8, leveraging the managed person to solve her own problem. This is, in the addiction framework, a recognizable dynamic. The therapist, the counselor, the sponsor, the family member who helped build the recovery structure, these people have their own needs and their own stakes in the outcome. The management system doesn't exist in a vacuum. It was built by people for reasons that mix genuine care with self-interest, and it carries that history inside it. Harry needed Dexter to be manageable because he loved him. and because a child he had raised becoming a monster was unacceptable. Vogel needed the code to work because she had staked her professional reputation on the theory that it could. The code serves Dexter. It also served the people who designed it. None of this makes the code wrong, but it makes it a little less purely selfless than the show's warm presentation of Harry tends to imply. Since we're on Harry's code and what it was designed to do, Season 3 is worth a careful look, because Season 3 is where the code meets its first serious stress test from inside rather than from outside. Not from someone trying to catch Dexter, but from someone who wants to participate. Miguel Prado is the assistant district attorney for Miami-Dade. He's charming, politically ambitious, deeply connected within the city's power structure, and by the time Season 3 reaches its midpoint, fully aware that Dexter is a killer. The circumstances of how he finds out are complicated and involve Dexter accidentally killing Miguel's brother Oscar during a planned kill that went sideways. But the important thing is what Miguel does with the knowledge once he has it. He doesn't go to the police. He doesn't use it as leverage in any straightforward way. He asks to be involved. Miguel Prado wants to kill people alongside Dexter. Or rather, he wants Dexter to kill people for him. People Miguel has identified as deserving it. People who have slipped through the legal system that Miguel operates within and emerge clean on the other side of it. People whose continued existence Miguel experiences as a professional and personal affront. He frames this as justice. He frames it as their shared moral code. He finds the idea of what Dexter does righteous, and he wants to be near it. What follows across Season 3 is one of the most uncomfortable storylines the show produces, not because it's gratuitously dark, but because it's so accurate about a specific relational dynamic. Miguel is functioning as an enabler, not in the traditional sense of someone who helps an addict continue using, but in the more specific sense of someone who validates and amplifies the behavior, who removes the friction that might otherwise create pause, who tells the addict that what they're doing is good and right and should continue. And Dexter responds to this. He's never had a friend in the real sense. Harry is a father figure, Deb is a sister, but there's no one who simply knows and accepts him without flinching. Miguel knows. And for a significant stretch of Season 3, Miguel doesn't flinch. He's enthusiastic. He's grateful. He treats Dexter's code not as a containment mechanism, but as a methodology that he wants to learn and apply. The bond that forms between them is built on the thing Dexter has spent his entire adult life hiding from everyone else. Here's where it connects to the addiction argument. In the recovery world, one of the recognized risk factors for relapse or for worsening of a compulsion is finding a community or a single person who normalizes and celebrates the behavior. The technical term is probably more clinical than what I'm reaching for, but the idea is simple. When you find someone who tells you that the thing you've been managing and suppressing is actually fine, actually good, actually a source of pride rather than something to be hidden, the management system is under threat, not because you've been bad or weak, because the management system runs partly on the friction of having to conceal. Remove the concealment, remove the shame, and the mechanism that keeps the thing contained starts to wobble. Miguel lets Dexter be Dexter in a way that Dexter has never been allowed to be. And Dexter's code under those conditions starts to bend. He teaches Miguel the process. He shares the ritual. He allows the ideology of the code, only kill those who deserve it, confirm guilt, follow the process, to be applied by someone else, which means it's no longer purely his. And the moment it stops being purely his, he stops being entirely in control of where it goes. Where it goes is this. Miguel starts using the code to kill people who aren't killers. He uses Dexter's methodology and Dexter's framework to eliminate a political rival, Ellen Wolf, a defense attorney whose work has frustrated Miguel professionally. She is not a killer. She is not someone the code would ever permit. But Miguel's version of the code, the one he absorbed from Dexter and then reinterpreted through his own ambition and his own grievances, has no problem with her. This is what happens when the harm reduction framework gets transmitted. The original code, designed by Harry and Dexter and calibrated to a specific set of conditions, carries constraints that are meaningful only because Dexter enforces them himself. Passed to someone else, the constraints disappear. Miguel takes the shape of the code, the ritual, the righteousness, the feeling of being above ordinary moral limits, and fills it with his own content. Dexter has to kill Miguel, and the show frames this as a necessary act, which it is, but there's something worth sitting with underneath the necessity. Dexter's willingness to have the enabling relationship in the first place, his hunger for someone who knows and accepts him, his pleasure in the bond, his lowering of the usual vigilance, is itself the compulsion reaching for something it needs. The dark passenger doesn't just want to kill, it wants to be known. And Miguel offered that, and the code bent under the weight of that wanting until Dexter had to break the relationship rather than the code. The season ends with Dexter more isolated than he began it. The thing he was offered, recognition, acceptance, a companion in the secret life, turned out to be incompatible with the management system, because the management system runs on isolation. You have to be alone with it. The moment you're not, the system changes shape, and this connects back to the addiction framework in a way that feels important. One of the standard recovery recommendations is community, connection, the opposite of using in secret, using in shame, using alone. The thinking is that isolation is what the compulsion feeds on. The secrecy, the loneliness of carrying something you can't share, the particular intensity that builds when a need has no witness. Connection is the antidote. But Dexter's harm reduction system works in precisely the opposite direction. The code requires that almost no one knows. The secret is structural. Miguel offering to know, offering to share the weight of it felt like relief, and it was, briefly, but the relief undid the mechanism. Because the code isn't just a set of rules Dexter follows. It's a set of rules that only hold when Dexter is the only person enforcing them. The moment Miguel was inside the code, interpreting it, applying it, the code became something different. It became a negotiable framework rather than a fixed one. And a negotiable code isn't a code. It's a conversation. Recovery leans toward community because community helps. The harm reduction system Dexter runs leans toward isolation because isolation contains. They are, on this specific point, pointing in opposite directions. And the Season 3 arc is the show asking what happens when an isolated management system briefly lets someone else in. And answering that question with blood and a strangled body and Dexter back at the start, alone again. Since we're talking about the people in Dexter's orbit, let's spend some proper time with Rita. Because I think Rita Bennett, later Rita Morgan, is one of the most carefully constructed characters in the show's early seasons, and her specific history is load-bearing in the addiction argument in ways that are easy to overlook. Rita is, before the show begins, already a person who has been defined by proximity to someone else's compulsion. Paul Bennett was a drug addict, a serious one, a violent one. The children grew up around it. Rita rebuilt herself after leaving him, built something stable, got her own routines, and her own sense of what a normal household could look like. By the time we meet her, she has a competence and a specific kind of alertness that you see in people who have spent years in survival mode next to someone unpredictable. She is warm, but she is also watchful. She has learned to read the small signs. And here's the thing that the show asks you to hold on to across the first 2 seasons. Rita accepts Dexter's cover story. She hears, "I'm an addict," and believes it. And the question of why she believes it is actually more interesting than the question of why Dexter offers it. Because Rita should, by her own history, be the hardest person in this story to fool. She knows what addiction looks like up close. She has the reference points. What she doesn't have, and this is the part I find genuinely moving if I'm honest, is the ability to believe that the same story is happening twice. She got out of a relationship with one addict. She rebuilt herself. She found someone who was gentle and present and reliable, someone who showed up and stayed and seemed to care about her children in a way that Paul never had. The idea that this person could be concealing something with the same basic shape as Paul's secret is too much to hold. Not because she's naive, because she's human. There's a very specific emotional pattern that sometimes develops in people who've loved addicts, and it involves becoming quite skilled at reading certain kinds of dishonesty while becoming less skilled at reading others. You get good at detecting the dishonesty you've already seen. You recognize the patterns of Paul's addiction. You're less able to see something that operates differently, that uses a different structure, that hides behind different behavior. Dexter's compulsion doesn't look like Paul's from the outside because its effects are different. Paul drank and raged and disappeared into addiction's chaos. Dexter disappears into a frightening competence, a stillness, a control that reads as the opposite of Paul's disorder. Rita wants Dexter to be what Paul wasn't. That desire doesn't make her foolish. It makes her a person who has survived something hard and is trying to build something good. And the show, to its enormous credit, treats her with the respect that deserves. It never makes Rita pathetic for not seeing through Dexter. It understands why she doesn't. The NA lie lands not just because the emotional shape is accurate, though it is, as we talked about earlier, but because Rita has a model for how to be in that story. She knows how to support a partner who is working a program. She knows what the good days look like and what the setbacks look like. She has experience that makes her useful. And I think on some level, that usefulness is part of what keeps her close. She isn't just being deceived, she's being given a role in which she can be genuinely valuable in a way that Paul's addiction never allowed. There's a season 4 detail worth noting here, if a bit tangentially. Rita's mother, Gail, visits in season 2 and tells Rita that something is wrong with Dexter. Not that he's an addict. Gail isn't working from any specific theory, just that something is off, and Rita defends him firmly and not unfairly. But Gail's instinct is correct in the most general possible sense, and Rita has access to the same instinct if she allows herself to use it. She doesn't. And I don't think that's a character flaw so much as a character truth. She has decided, on the basis of the evidence available to her, that Dexter is someone worth fighting for. She puts him in recovery, she drives him to meetings, she celebrates his progress. And every step of that is genuine care expressed inside a fiction that neither of them quite has the words to dismantle. Rita's death at the end of season 4 is the show's most brutal statement about what happens to the people inside Dexter's radius. She doesn't die because of anything she did. She dies because Trinity, who had already locked onto Dexter, needed to take something from him. She is the collateral damage of his compulsion reaching out and touching a life she was never supposed to be part of. The addiction story ends for Rita the only way the show knows how to end things for the people who love Dexter, not with revelation, not with escape, with the bathtub and Harrison sitting in the water. And then there are Aster and Cody, Rita's children from her marriage to Paul. They deserve a mention, however brief, because they're part of the picture in a way that the show doesn't always foreground. Aster and Cody grew up around Paul's addiction. They know before they've had the vocabulary for it, what it looks like when an adult's life is organized around something they can't control. They know the specific fear of that. They know the way the household atmosphere changes when the thing is present versus when it's been temporarily managed. And then Rita brings Dexter into their lives, and Dexter is whatever else he is, not that. He's stable, he's reliable, he shows up, he doesn't rage. The contrast with Paul is so stark that Aster and Cody attach to Dexter with the particular gratitude of children who have already been through the worst version of the story. Cody puts an action figure in Dexter's bag when they go on a trip. It's a small detail, but the show puts it in there quite deliberately. He wants Dexter to have something of his. He wants the connection to travel with him. This is what a child does when they've found an adult who feels safe. They extend the bond beyond the immediate physical space. They try to make it last. The show can't fully pursue what the eventual revelation of Dexter's nature would mean for Aster and Cody without dismantling the story it's telling. So it removes them. They go to live with their grandparents after Rita's death and largely disappear from the narrative. But their presence in seasons 1 through 4 is the show making an argument about who bears the cost of the compulsion. Not just Rita, not just Deb. Children who didn't choose any of this, who attached to the managed version of Dexter because he was so much better than what they'd known before. Since we're talking about Harry's code as a management system and about what happens to the people inside Dexter's radius, Season 4 gives us something remarkable. A character who functions almost entirely as a portrait of what Dexter could become without the code. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer. And I want to be careful here because Trinity is obviously a different kind of person from Dexter. His cycle is different, his victims are different, his internal architecture is different. This isn't a direct one-to-one comparison. But the show puts them together in the same season quite deliberately, and it does something very specific with that proximity. It lets Dexter look at Trinity and see a man who built his entire life around managing a compulsion, and who built the management so badly that the compulsion consumed everything. Trinity kills in a cycle of 3, a drowning, a falling, a bludgeoning. He's been doing this since the 1960s. He has a family, a wife, 2 children, a public life as a church volunteer and community figure. He builds houses for Habitat for Humanity. He presents, from the outside, as exactly the kind of person you would never suspect. Not because he's charming in the slick, obvious way of fictional villains, but because he is genuinely functional in the parts of life that people can see. He has compartmentalized the compulsion so completely that it exists almost on a separate track from his ordinary existence. Dexter admires this. That's the thing the season uses as its engine. Dexter's fascination with Arthur is partly the fascination of someone who sees a model for doing exactly what he is trying to do. Trinity has been managing this compulsion for decades without being caught. He has the family that Dexter's trying to build. He has the double life that Dexter has been running, extended and survived across an extraordinary length of time. Dexter wants to know how he did it. What Dexter finds when he gets close enough to see the actual interior of Arthur Mitchell's life is that Arthur didn't manage the compulsion. The compulsion managed him. The family is not a warm domestic life that Arthur has protected from his darkness. The family is a hostage situation. His wife and children live in fear of him. The violence that produces his public cycle of kills has a private parallel. The control, the cruelty, the periodic eruptions, running through his home life constantly. He is not someone who has figured out how to keep the two things separate. He is someone who treats everything and everyone in his life as material for the management of something they have no name for. The Habitat for Humanity work is not generosity. It's the other end of the cycle, the penance and the performance of normalcy that follows each killing sequence. Arthur has a ritual that extends beyond the kills themselves. The whole structure of his visible life, the church, the volunteering, the family, is part of the management system. He has built a life-sized container for his compulsion. But the container is a prison for everyone inside it. This is what the code was designed to prevent. Harry's specific insight, and it was specific, which is why Vogel's involvement as a clinical specialist makes sense, was that a management system built on cruelty to the people closest to you would eventually collapse. The code's prohibition on killing innocents isn't just ethical, it's structural. It prevents the specific corrosion that happened to Trinity, where the violence that belongs in one compartment starts seeping through the walls into every other space. And yet, Dexter's management system, for all its elegance compared to Trinity's, still produces the bathtub at the end of season 4, still produces Rita dead in the water while Harrison sits beside her. Not because Dexter's code failed in any technical sense. Dexter didn't kill Rita, but because his compulsion, organized and directed as carefully as it is, attracts Trinity into his orbit. The code prevents Dexter from becoming Trinity. It does not prevent Trinity from finding Dexter. The show is making a specific and somewhat bleak point with this. Even a well-designed management system has the compulsion at its center, and the compulsion has a gravity. It pulls things toward it. Sometimes it pulls the wrong things. Trinity pulled toward Dexter because Dexter was investigating him, and Dexter was investigating him because of the compulsion, the fascination, the admiration, the need to know how someone like himself had endured so long. The code kept Dexter from becoming Arthur Mitchell. But the reason Dexter was standing in Arthur Mitchell's orbit in the first place was the same need the code is designed to manage. There's a circularity to it that the show never quite resolves. One more observation about Trinity, because it feels relevant to what we've been building tonight. Arthur Mitchell is not depicted as someone who is entirely without interior life or self-awareness. There are moments in season 4 where John Lithgow lets you see something underneath the performance. Arthur knows what he is. He has known for a long time. He has built his entire existence around the knowledge, and the building has cost him and everyone around him everything. He is not someone who escaped the question Dexter asks himself every episode. He is someone who answered it by constructing a larger and more elaborate silence around it. The question is still there. He just can't hear it anymore over the noise of everything he's built to suppress it. Dexter killing Trinity is not a victory in any clean sense. It's the show removing the cautionary mirror before Dexter can look at it long enough to understand what he's seeing. Trinity is what Dexter avoids. He is also what Dexter might still become, given enough time and enough strain on the structures that currently hold everything in place. There's one more detail about the Trinity arc that I find quietly devastating. Dexter hesitates to kill him. He has multiple opportunities and he delays. He keeps telling himself it's because he wants to learn from Trinity, to understand how he survived so long, how he built the double life and maintained it. And that's true on one level. But the hesitation is also something else. Dexter found in Trinity something he didn't expect to find. A person who is the same kind of thing he is, who has been running the same kind of life for decades, and who has a family and a home and the surface appearance of belonging to the world. He found proof that it's possible to last, and so he waits, he studies, he tells himself he needs more information before he acts, and the waiting costs Rita her life. The compulsion's desire to see itself reflected, to find proof of its own sustainability, is what delays Dexter and produces the worst single moment in the show's run. This is the dark passenger wanting something it shouldn't have. Not a kill, but a mirror. The mirror was Trinity, and looking into it too long is what killed Rita. Now we need to talk about Deborah, because Deb's story, particularly from the season 6 finale through to the end of season 8, is the show's most detailed portrait of what happens to someone who knows the secret and cannot leave. For the first 6 seasons, Deb's relationship with Dexter is the emotional spine of the show. She loves him. He is her brother, her anchor, the person she calls when things go badly and when things go well. There's a kind of uncomplicated loyalty between them that the show treats as genuinely sacred, which is part of why the season 6 finale lands as hard as it does. Deb walks into a shipping container to tell Dexter she has feelings for him. A storyline that is, let's be diplomatic, complicated in execution. And what she finds instead is Dexter killing someone on a plastic-wrapped table. Everything after that is the fallout. Season 7 is Deb's season in ways that I think get underappreciated because the other plots are louder. The Isaac Serco arc, the Hannah McKay introduction, the LaGuerta investigation heating up. There's a lot happening. But running underneath all of it is Deb going through the emotional equivalent of discovering that the person you've built your entire sense of safety around is not what you thought, and watching her do that while being completely unable to act on it because she loves him too much and because the consequences of exposing him are unthinkable is genuinely uncomfortable. in the way that the show at its best makes you genuinely uncomfortable. She finds out, tries to process it, fails to process it, helps him cover things up, and then, at the end of season 7, shoots Maria Lagerta to protect him. She kills someone. Not in the abstract, the show has her pull-a-trigger way. She shoots someone she knows in a place she recognizes, while that person is begging for her life. And she does it to protect Dexter, because in that moment she cannot choose anything else. That's what the show means when it uses the word addiction around Dexter. Not his compulsion, but his effect. Deb is addicted to the version of Dexter she loves, and she will compromise herself completely to protect it. That's the thing addiction does to the people adjacent to it. Not just the user's life, but the lives of everyone in the orbit, shaped, rerouted, ultimately damaged. By the time season 8 begins, Deb has left Miami Metro. She's working as a private investigator, which mostly seems to involve bail jumps and not sleeping. She has distanced herself from Dexter as thoroughly as she can manage, which in practice is not very thoroughly at all, because she can't quite cut the thread. She turns up at crime scenes while intoxicated. She drives into a parking meter at 4 a.m. and wakes up with open beer containers in her lap. She gets picked up by a cop, and when she realizes she's crashed into a parking meter, she starts laughing. It is one of the most quietly painful things Jennifer Carpenter does in the whole series. That laugh, it's the laugh of someone who has run out of other responses. Dr. Vogel, who in season 8 begins treating Deb alongside her work with Dexter, makes the clinical diagnosis explicit. The alcohol and the drugs, she tells Deb, are keeping her numb. They are managing the symptoms of her PTSD, and they are making the PTSD worse. The substances are not the source of the problem. They are the response to a source that hasn't been addressed, which is, when you write it out, precisely the argument we've been building about Dexter all along. The substance isn't the story. The substance is what you reach for when the story gets too heavy. There's a particular scene in season 8 that I want to spend a minute with. Deb goes back to Miami Metro while drunk, more drunk than she's managing in public, and tries to tell Quinn what she's done, that she killed Lagerta. Quinn takes her to an empty interview room. He can hear that she's saying something significant, but she's incoherent enough that he can't quite follow it. He thinks she's just intoxicated and talking nonsense. Dexter gets the call, rushes over, and injects Deb with a low dose of M99, the same drug he uses on his victims, while Quinn isn't looking. He tells everyone that Deb passed out. He carries her out over his shoulder. He takes her home and handcuffs her to the couch. The layers in that scene, Dexter sedating his sister to protect his own secret, using a drug he uses in his kills to contain her crisis, treating the person most damaged by his compulsion as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped, and then calling Vogel to come and deal with it. He loves Deb, that's not in question, but his first response to her crisis is containment, not care. He manages the immediate threat to himself and then calls in professional support for the collateral damage. That's harm reduction applied to the people around him rather than to the compulsion itself. The code contains what Dexter does. Whatever tools are available in a given moment contain what Dexter's doing does to everyone else. One more thing about season 7, Deb, before we get to the season's end. There's a detail in the middle of the season that I find genuinely affecting, and it's small enough that it's easy to move past it. Deb devises a plan where Dexter moves in with her. She calls it rehab, serial killer rehab. Her reasoning is that if she watches him 24 hours a day, she can keep him from killing. And if she can keep him from killing long enough, maybe something changes. Maybe there's a way out of the situation they're both now inside. She makes rules. She sleeps by the door. She tells him that if he's honest with her about everything, about the need, about what it feels like, about the sequence of the compulsion, she can help him. And Dexter, in one of the more quietly significant moments in the series, tells her the truth. He tells her that the need starts with seeing blood, that seeing blood turns black in his mind, that from there it moves through a specific progression toward the kill. He describes the internal architecture of the compulsion to someone who loves him for the first time in his life, using words rather than the voiceover that only we can hear. Deb listens to this and then asks what she can do to help. And there's no good answer. There's no answer at all, really. She's asking how to help someone manage something that the only framework for managing is the one Harry built 20 years ago. She doesn't have Harry's advantage. She didn't have time to build the structure before the compulsion was already formed. She's trying to insert a management system retroactively with love as the primary tool. It doesn't work in any lasting sense, but the attempt matters. Deb's rehab plan, which is absurd, practically speaking, and the show knows it's absurd, is the most direct expression of what the people who love Dexter actually want to offer him. Not exposure, not punishment, not abandonment. Help, however inadequate, however futile. They want to sit beside the thing and see if sitting beside it is enough. It never is. But the wanting is real, and the show treats it seriously, even as it makes clear that the wanting cannot change the outcome. One more dimension to the Season 7 Deb arc that I want to name before we move on. The show asks us to understand something very specific about the Lagerta shooting at the end of the season, and it's something that the violence of the moment can obscure if you're watching quickly. Deb doesn't shoot Lagerta because she's become callous. She doesn't shoot her because protecting Dexter has erased her moral compass. She shoots her because she has been in the shipping container for long enough that the only remaining move is an impossible one. And she makes it. The specific cruelty of that situation is that Lagerta is begging. She's looking at Deb, appealing to her, saying the things you say when you're trying to reach a person rather than a weapon. And Deb, who is a police lieutenant who has spent her career protecting people, who has built her entire professional identity on exactly the moral commitments that Lagerta is appealing to. Deb shoots her while Lagerta is speaking. And the show is honest that this is not heroism and not corruption. It's the endpoint of a very long process of compromise, each step of which Deb made because she loved Dexter and because the previous step had already been taken, and because there was never a clean moment to stop. By the time the gun is in Deb's hand and Lagerta is on her knees, Deb has already been through so many points of no return that this one doesn't feel qualitatively different from any of them. It feels like the next thing. That accumulation, the way each compromise makes the next one feel like a smaller step, is one of the most realistic things about Deb's arc, and it maps onto how a lot of the serious damage in addiction relationships actually happens. Not in one dramatic rupture, but in a long series of small ones, each of which seemed survivable at the time. Let me stay with Deb a little longer, because Season 8 is where her arc reaches the place the show had been building towards since the shipping container, and it's worth going through it slowly. There's a sequence in Season 8, Episode 3, What's Eating Dexter Morgan, which is a great title, where Deb has been sleeping in her car. It's 4 a.m. A police officer taps on the window. She opens her eyes slowly and takes a second to orient. She's surrounded by open containers. She's crashed into a parking meter, which she didn't notice. The officer tells her she's done damage to city property and she needs to get out of the car. She walks unsteadily to the front of the car, sees the parking meter, and starts laughing. It's one of those moments that the show handles better than it should. The laugh is funny, technically, it's absurd, but it's also the laugh of dissociation, the laugh that comes when a person has been through enough that the evidence of their own collapse registers as comedy rather than alarm. I've always thought that laugh was the best piece of acting Jennifer Carpenter does in the season. It's not a good laugh. It's a broken one, but it works formally as funny, which means the audience is allowed to feel something uncomfortable alongside the humor rather than just one or the other. Vogel has a clear-eyed read on where Deb is. She tells Dexter that she's not sure Deb has hit rock bottom yet. She says he should prepare for the possibility that Deb might never want to be in his life again. Dexter rejects this because Dexter doesn't let people go, which is one of his better qualities and also one of the reasons his relationships end the way they do. He gets Vogel to take Deb in. Vogel keeps her at her house to prevent substance use while treating the PTSD directly, which, in practical terms, is a version of medical detox, removing access to the thing being used to manage the pain while addressing the pain at its source. It's the closest the show gets to depicting an actual structured recovery process for anyone other than Dexter's NA story. And notably, it's Deb going through it rather than Dexter. There's a lovely and very dark irony in the fact that Deb ends up receiving more legitimate therapeutic care than Dexter ever does. Dexter gets the code, which is management. Dexter gets Lila, who makes things worse. Dexter gets Vogel, who is useful but is also using him to track a killer and has her own agenda. Deb gets the shipping container and EMDR and someone actually taking her PTSD seriously. The person who didn't choose any of this gets more real treatment than the person whose compulsion started it. Vogel takes Deb back to the shipping container where she shot Lagerta. It's a PTSD treatment technique, returning to the site of a traumatic event in a safe context to process it, and it works in the show's telling as a turning point. Deb begins slowly to be able to hold what she did without it destroying her in real time. She begins to be able to stay in a room with Dexter without the entire world going sideways. It doesn't fix everything, it doesn't fix most things, but it's movement. The El Sapo subplot, where it turns out Deb shot someone during a blackout and can't fully account for what happened, is the show's most direct statement about what alcohol and trauma do together. She tells Dexter, "I'm a little fucking fuzzy on it. I was angry. I wanted the jewels back. And the next thing I know, I'm standing over a dead body." She is describing a dissociative episode, the anger, the substance, the gap in memory. This is what rock bottom looks like for someone who is both self-destructive and functional. Not collapsed in the street, but standing over someone they killed with no clear recollection of the decision to do it. Dexter helps her cover it up, because that's what Dexter does. That's the pattern. His compulsion creates damage. The damage creates crisis. The crisis gets managed. The management covers everything and changes nothing, and she knows it. There's a line she delivers in that same alley conversation that I think is one of the most honest things in the show's run. Dexter asks what she would have done if he weren't there. She says, essentially, "You're the reason I need someone there." What if you weren't a serial killer? What if Harry had left you in that fucking shipping container? She's not wrong, and she's also the one calling him for help. That's codependence by any reasonable description. The relationship is sustaining itself on the terms of the harm it produces. She can't leave him because she loves him and because the damage he caused is too embedded in her identity to step away from. He can't let her go because she's the person who knows, and also because he genuinely loves her. The addiction isn't just Dexter's anymore, if it ever was. It's spread through the relationship they share. Before we move on from Deb's Season 8 arc, there's the shipping container scene, which is one of the most formally interesting things the show does in its final run, and which connects directly to everything we've been talking about. Vogel brings Deb back to the actual physical shipping container where she shot Maria Lagerta, not a recreation, the place itself. She wants Deb to stand in the space where the trauma happened, to reoccupy it in a controlled setting, to move through it rather than around it. It's a recognized technique for processing traumatic events, and the show presents it without too much commentary. It just puts Deb back in that container and lets you sit with what that means. What strikes me about it is the specific geography. The container is the same kind of structure where Dexter's story began, where his mother was killed, where he and Brian were found in the blood, where the origin of the whole thing is located. The container is the show's recurring image for the contained space where terrible things happen. Vogel brought Dexter's story out of a container, metaphorically, when she and Harry built the code, and now she's putting Deb back into one to try to extract her from what the code eventually produced. There's a symmetry there that the show doesn't announce but which feels deliberate. The treatment for the casualty of the management system uses the same architecture as the original wound. You go back into the space. You face what happened there. You try to stop carrying it somewhere it doesn't belong. Deb tells Vogel in that container that she had a memory of killing Dexter instead of Lagerta. She's unsure whether that thought makes her feel better or worse. Vogel interprets this as dissociation from the genuine grief of what she actually did. I've always read it slightly differently, as Deb's psyche trying to find the true source of the wound, which isn't Lagerta, however terrible that moment was. The true source is Dexter. The thing she actually needed to do and couldn't was protect herself from him. The fantasy of shooting him instead of Lagerta is the fantasy of a person who can see the origin of the damage and imagines the moment when she might have stopped it. She didn't stop it. She couldn't. That's the nature of the relationship. And the container, which is the space Vogel uses to try to help her process it, is the show's way of saying the wound is architectural. It goes all the way back. The treatment will have to go all the way back too. And then there's Harrison, which is where the show asks the question it's been circling for almost 20 years. Is any of this heritable? New Blood picks up a decade or so after the original series ends. Harrison, who was an infant in season 4 and a toddler through season 8, is now a teenager, and he's found Dexter in the small fictional town of Iron Lake, New York. Dexter has been living quietly as Jim Lindsay, a sporting goods store employee with a girlfriend and a low profile. Harrison has had a difficult adolescence, various foster situations after Dexter faked his death, a period with Hannah in Argentina that the show doesn't spend long on. He has scars on his body from self-harm. He is carrying a significant amount of pain that nobody has been particularly well equipped to address. The party episode is one of New Blood's most striking sequences, and I think it's worth walking through carefully. Harrison's invited to a party. He goes. He's socially uncertain in the way of someone who hasn't had consistent community, who has moved too many times and been shaped by too many different environments to have found a settled version of himself. A girl approaches and offers him ecstasy. He takes it along with some beer. He takes more substances later, a blue pill from someone named Scott. And then, in a state that's a mixture of high and drunk and probably a fair amount of underlying pain finally having a root out, he does something that should get attention. He slices a carved letter H into a girl's foot when she dares him to prove he's brave, essentially. And then walks away when she says it hurts. It's not the action of a person having a fun night out. It's the action of a person who is not quite in their body, who doesn't register someone else's pain as a signal to stop, who is using the substances to get somewhere they can't get to sober, a place where the rules feel different and the normal weight of things is suspended. Audrey finds him passed out and calls 911. Harrison survives. Sergeant Logan informs Dexter, who rushes to the hospital. Dexter's response to all of this is instructive. He tells Harrison he's going to start seeing a therapist. He restricts his movements to school and home. These are reasonable responses to an overdose situation. But the deeper thing Dexter wants to do, the thing he gets to do a couple of episodes later when he finally opens up to Harrison, is to explain the code, to pass it on. Harrison has dark urges, and Dexter's solution is to give him the same framework Harry gave him. Think about that for a second. A teenager overdoses at a party, and his father's therapeutic instinct is to offer him a structured system for channeling violent impulses rather than to address what he was numbing. Dexter skips past the substance use almost entirely. He's interested in the darkness underneath it, which he recognizes, which feels familiar, which gives him something he knows how to respond to. The drug use is noise. The dark urges are signal. That's how Dexter interprets it, and he might not be entirely wrong. Harrison does have a history with self-harm and with impulsivity. The dark urges are real, but the drugs and alcohol at the party, Those are doing something. They're providing a route to a state that Harrison can't access any other way yet. They're the coping mechanism on top of the wound, and nobody in New Blood is particularly interested in the coping mechanism. Dexter wants to address the wound directly by giving Harrison the code. That's his version of care. The difference between Harrison's drug use and Dexter's killing as a practical matter is significant. Harrison's substances are impulsive, social, tied to a specific moment and context. He takes what's offered at a party when he's in emotional freefall. There's no ritual, there's no method, there's no code. This is not someone who has built a structured relationship with a compulsion. This is someone who is hurting and grabbed the nearest available thing that made the hurting feel less acute. But Dexter can't see that distinction because the framework he has for understanding dark inner states is the one Harry gave him. He sees the darkness and offers the tool for managing darkness. The possibility that Harrison might need something different, actual consistent therapeutic support, a stable home, a father who is present without an agenda, is harder for Dexter to provide because Dexter has never actually had any of those things himself. There's a line later in New Blood that I find genuinely affecting, where Dexter tells Harrison he never needs to feel alone with his dark thoughts again, that he was born in blood just like him, that he had the same violent urges, that he's going to tell him the code the way Harry told him. It's sincere, it's a real offer of connection. And it's also a father trying to give his child the only gift he knows how to give, which is the gift that was given to him. Whether that's enough, whether the code is the right inheritance for Harrison, is something New Blood doesn't quite get to answer before the series ends in its particular way. But the drug overdose scene is what unlocks the father-son conversation, which means Harrison's substance use is the event that creates the space for the deepest emotional intimacy the show gives them, which is a thing that happens sometimes. Crisis as the door to connection. It doesn't redeem the overdose, but it does give it a function in the story's architecture. There's a small but meaningful confrontation between Dexter and Sergeant Logan after the hospital scene that I want to note. Logan advises Dexter to give Harrison tough love. Dexter pushes back, telling Logan he's not a parenting expert just because he's an assistant wrestling coach. It's a bit of a deflection, but it also reflects something true about how Dexter approaches Harrison's situation. Dexter doesn't want to apply an external framework, someone else's protocol for troubled teenagers. He wants to apply his framework, the one he was given, the code. Logan isn't wrong that Harrison needs structure and limit setting. He's just wrong about what kind of structure. And Dexter is right that Logan doesn't understand the specifics. He's just also not quite right about what he's going to offer instead. The scene is the show doing something it does quietly well, putting two people in the same position, both partially correct, both missing something important, and letting the gap between them be the thing you notice. What Dexter eventually offers Harrison in the sequence where he opens up about the code is genuine. It is. He is giving his son the most honest and most useful thing he has, a way of living with the dark thoughts rather than being destroyed by them. That's not nothing. That's actually something significant. The code kept Dexter from becoming Trinity. It might be the difference for Harrison between a life that holds and a life that doesn't. But the drug overdose is still there in the background, unaddressed in the way Dexter tends to leave things unaddressed when he's found a larger pattern to attend to. Harrison's substance use that night wasn't the code problem. It was the loneliness problem, the instability problem. The spent years moving between situations, nobody really prepared him for problem. And the code doesn't touch any of that. The code is for the dark thoughts. It's not for the reasons a teenager gets handed an unknown pill at a party and swallows it. Nobody in New Blood ever quite gets to that. The show ends before Harrison can find out whether the code is enough or whether there's more work to do. That's left open, which is, in its way, honest. But the generational question that New Blood introduces is one worth sitting with before we move on. because it reframes the whole arc of what we've been discussing tonight. Dexter's compulsion began with the shipping container, his mother's death, the blood, the trauma that shaped what he became before he was old enough to have any say in it. Harry's response was the code, a management system handed down by a parent to a child who needed it. Harrison's story is the next layer of that same question. He was also in blood as an infant, not blood he witnessed, but blood he sat in. While his mother died in the bathtub beside him, he has, in the most literal sense, the same origin story. And Dexter's response to discovering this is to offer the code, the same transmission, father to son, a generation later. What New Blood can't quite resolve, and I think genuinely doesn't know the answer to, is whether the code was the right thing to offer Dexter, let alone whether it's the right thing to offer Harrison. Harry made the code because he loved Dexter and had no other tools. Dexter makes the same offer to Harrison for the same reason. The gesture is genuine both times. Whether the gesture is sufficient is the question the show circles without landing on. And that unresolved quality, that open inheritance, is actually the most honest thing New Blood does. It doesn't tell you the code fixes Harrison. It tells you Dexter offered it and Harrison received it, and whatever comes next is still ahead of them. The addiction argument doesn't resolve. It passes to the next generation and keeps going. And that brings us to Hannah McKay, who is, among many things, the show's most direct challenge to the entire Dark Passenger framework. Hannah arrives in season 7 as a witness in a cold case, someone who was present at a series of murders committed by her then-boyfriend when she was 15. The investigation is reopened. What becomes clear fairly quickly is that Hannah was not a passive witness. Hannah participated, not under duress, not coerced. She made choices at 15 and after that resulted in deaths. She's been making those choices quietly ever since, operating as someone who solves problems by eliminating them when eliminating them seems like the cleanest option. She and Dexter are immediately drawn to each other, which makes sense in a very specific way. She's the first person he's met who operates inside the same logic without requiring the whole mythology around it. No dark passenger, no code, no complicated architecture of justification. Hannah kills when Hannah decides killing is the right response to a situation, and she's fine. The conversation between them in season 7 about the dark passenger is one of the show's most interesting moments, and it happens almost casually. Dexter's explaining why he needs to pursue a particular target. He references the dark passenger. My dark passenger really wants to be somewhere else. Hannah asks what that means. He explains it's his name for the need to kill. She asks why it's a separate entity. He says it's like something living inside him, telling him what to do, leaving him no choice. Hannah's response is essentially, no, it isn't. That's just you. You're the one who wants this. You have a choice and you're making it. She's not cruel about it. She's not contemptuous. She seems genuinely interested in understanding the distinction he's drawing, but she can't find the distinction because from where she's standing there isn't one. She follows through, as she puts it. She doesn't have a passenger. She has a will that moves in a particular direction. The direction is the same as Dexter's. The metaphysics are completely different. What I find interesting about Hannah is that the show uses her to stress test the dark passenger idea without coming down firmly on either side. You could argue that Hannah's framework, this is just me, I choose this, is actually healthier psychologically. She doesn't need a mythology to function. She doesn't externalize. She owns her choices with a kind of clear-eyed directness that Dexter never manages. And by the end of the series, she is, of all the major characters, the one who has managed to build something. She's in Argentina with Harrison. She's alive. She's not destroyed. And yet the show doesn't straightforwardly endorse Hannah's model either. The things she does, poisoning Deb, which the show eventually confirms, using chemistry to remove people who inconvenience her, those aren't framed as admirable. They're framed as pragmatic in a way that sits uncomfortably. The absence of the dark passenger mythology doesn't make Hannah a better person. It just makes her a less conflicted one. There's a particular observation worth making about what Hannah represents in the addiction argument. In recovery frameworks, one of the ongoing debates is about the language of choice versus the language of disease. The disease model says addiction is not a choice. It's a chronic condition of the brain, and treating it as a moral failure is both inaccurate and counterproductive. The choice model says, and without necessarily being dismissive of the neurological reality, that the agency of the individual matters, that treating someone as entirely without choice can itself become an obstacle to change. The show puts this debate on screen between Dexter and Hannah without naming it, and gives both positions a genuine spokesperson. Dexter holds the disease model functionally. He has the dark passenger, he has limited choice. He manages as best he can within the parameters of what he is. Hannah holds something closer to the radical agency position. She is what she is, she chooses what she chooses, and the only honest thing is to own that. Neither of them recovers. That's the show's quiet verdict on both positions. The disease model and the radical agency model both lead to the same place, which is a person continuing to do what they do until something external stops them. Dexter's stopping force is New Blood's ending. Hannah's, presumably, is something still ahead of her in Argentina or in whatever resurrection has in store. But the conversation between them, that one Season 7 exchange about the dark passenger, is the show naming the question it's been asking since Season 2. Is this a thing being done to Dexter or a thing Dexter does? Is the compulsion a passenger or a driver? And the honest answer, which the show approaches carefully in that hairy dialogue we talked about earlier, is that it might be both at different times in different ways, which is not a satisfying answer, but it's probably the true one. One last thing about Hannah before we move into the final synthesis. There's a moment in Season 7 where she corrects Dexter when he says, "Dark Rider," by accident. She says, "You're dark what?" And Dexter has to explain it. My need to kill, the thing living inside me, the thing that leaves me no choice. And Hannah's response, when she's absorbed this, is to tell him that she follows through on things and she doesn't have one of those. No passenger, no mythology. She does what she does. What I find interesting about that correction scene is what Dexter does next, which is to insist on the distinction. He insists that what he does is different from what Hannah does, even though the practical difference is difficult to identify from the outside. Both of them have killed multiple people. Both of them are living freely in Miami. Both of them are functional adults. The distinction Dexter is reaching for is internal, the feeling of compulsion versus the feeling of choice. And Hannah, looking at him from the outside, can't find the purchase for that distinction. She might be right that there isn't one, in any objective sense. Or she might be wrong, and the distinction might matter enormously in ways that only the person inside it can perceive. The show doesn't decide. It just lets them sit next to each other, these two people who do the same things for apparently different reasons, and leaves the question open. What the show does decide in its own way is that Dexter's mythology, the dark passenger, the code, the whole elaborate architecture, has costs that Hannah's simpler framework avoids. Dexter's mythology requires maintenance. It requires the NA cover story and the bloodslide ritual and the voiceover and the constant internal negotiation. Hannah just has her will and where it points. The myth is more expensive than the agency. Whether it's also more honest is the question neither of them fully answers. So let's pull back. Let's look at the whole picture. We've been through the cover story and what it actually covered. The NA meetings and the speech that was honest about the wrong thing. The sponsor who weaponized the language of recovery. The dark passenger and what Harry said about it in Season 7. The code as harm reduction rather than treatment. Rita and the specific emotional history that made her the perfect person to receive Dexter's cover story. Deb's descent through alcohol and dissociation to a parking lot at 4 a.m. Harrison's overdose, and the father who saw the darkness first and the substance almost not at all. Hannah, who says it plainly. That's just you, you're choosing this. What does the show actually believe when you put all of that next to each other? I think it believes this, that the substance is never the story, that what a person reaches for, killing, heroin, wine in a parking lot, is the response to something else, something that was there before the reaching started and will still be there if the reaching stops. And that the question of whether someone is managing their compulsion or being managed by it is one that the same person can answer differently on different days. Dexter, across the whole run of the show, is never in recovery. He is in management. The code holds him, most of the time, within certain lines. He doesn't kill innocents, at least not intentionally. He follows the ritual. He contains the need within a structure. He goes to work and raises children and has relationships and functions productively and with real warmth as a person. The compulsion sits inside all of that, organized rather than suppressed, directed rather than resolved. And here's what's interesting about that. From the outside, the harm reduction model works in the sense that Dexter does not become a chaotic, destructive force in the way that Harry's worst-case scenario imagined. The code holds, mostly. The damage is largely contained within the code's targets. Miami Metro never catches him, not because the investigation is incompetent, though the investigation is sometimes incompetent, but because Dexter is meticulous. The management is effective, and yet the collateral damage is real, and it accumulates outside the code's lines. Rita dies. Not because the code failed. There's no code provision for Trinity targeting her family. Deb is destroyed, not by anything the code was designed to prevent. The code says nothing about what happens to the people who find out. Harrison grows up without a father and with an inheritance of dark thoughts and a teenager's impulsive relationship with substances. And Dexter's response is to transmit the code rather than examine whether the code was the right answer in the first place. The harm reduction model contains the compulsion and does not prevent the spread of its effects. That's the show's honest assessment, I think. Not a condemnation of harm reduction. Just a recognition that it has a scope, and outside that scope, the damage moves freely. There's something else the show does, quietly across the whole run, that I want to name. It never lets Dexter feel easy about this. He has his justifications and his frameworks and his dark passenger and his code. He has the voiceovers that construct an internal world that is comprehensible and even sometimes sympathetic. And yet, he never stops asking whether he's a monster. He never stops checking against Harry's standard. He never fully settles into the comfortable certainty of a person who has made peace with what they are. Actually, since we're on the voiceover, I want to spend a moment with it as a formal device, because I think it does something specific and underappreciated in the addiction argument. The voiceover is Dexter's internal monologue. It runs across the whole series. It's what lets the audience stay inside his perspective, understand his reasoning, experience his curiosity and his occasional warmth and his genuine love for the people in his life. Without the voiceover, Dexter is simply a man doing terrible things. With the voiceover, he is a person we are inside of, which is uncomfortable and also, for the show's purposes, necessary. But the voiceover is also a rationalization machine. It is the internal process by which Dexter continuously justifies what he does. He explains the code, applies the code, checks against the code, confirms guilt, narrates the ritual, processes the aftermath. The voiceover is never not working. It never stops. And that non-stop quality is something worth noticing, because it maps precisely on what the internal monologue of an active addict looks like. The constant processing, the justification, the checking, the managing of the gap between the behavior and the self-image. The voiceover is the management system rendered audible. Every episode, we hear Dexter doing the cognitive work of living with what he is. Not once, continuously for 8 seasons. The management system requires that level of maintenance. It doesn't run on autopilot. It runs on the constant, effortful, never completed work of staying inside the code and staying connected to the version of himself that deserves to be in Rita's house, in Deb's life and Harrison's world. That's exhausting. The show doesn't name it as exhausting. Dexter presents as someone who finds the ritual pleasurable rather than burdensome, and that's probably also accurate. But the volume of cognitive work required is visible, and it's part of what the addiction framing captures. This is not a person who is free. He is a person who is continuously working to remain manageable. That's not recovery, but it's also not nothing. The addict who is still asking the question, who is still checking in, still taking the inventory, still holding the uncertainty, is not the same as the addict who has stopped asking. Dexter keeps asking, not in the way that leads to change, or at least not in the way that leads to durable change. But the question is always present, and that, in a show with a lot of clever structural decisions and a lot of places where convenience wins over honesty, feels like a genuine commitment. The writers decided that Dexter Morgan would never be at peace with himself, never satisfied, never able to say, yes, this is fine, this is who I am, this is enough. The dark passenger is always there. The code is always required. The question is always open. He is, in that specific sense, the most accurate portrait of an unresolved compulsion that a mainstream drama has probably ever built. The show never gets to a cure, deliberately, and I think that's, on balance, the right call. Because a cure for Dexter would be a different story, and this is the story the show wanted to tell. The story of the management, the cost of the management, the people shaped by proximity to the management, the question that never closes. There's something worth mentioning about Dexter, Original Sin here, even though it's a prequel series, and exists in a slightly different register from what we've been discussing tonight. The prequel sets its story in 1991 before the code is fully formed. Young Dexter, played by Patrick Gibson, is in the process of becoming who we know him to be. Harry is still alive. The rituals haven't been established yet. The Dark Passenger has been named but hasn't been given its operational framework. What Original Sin is doing structurally is showing us the period between the origin and the management. The period when the compulsion exists but the harm reduction system doesn't yet, which means it's showing us the most dangerous version of Dexter. The one without the code's guardrails, the one who is all compulsion and no channel. There's a reason the addiction framework maps so cleanly onto what we see there. Without the harm reduction protocol, what you have is simply someone in the acute phase of a compulsion they don't know how to manage. The code is what the rest of the series is built on. Original Sin is what the code was built to contain. I mention it because it reframes something about the main series that I've always felt but not quite articulated. When the main series begins, Dexter is already managed. He has been managed for years. We're meeting the harm reduction version of him, not the unmanaged version. The compulsion is still there, entirely, completely, constantly. But it's already inside a structure. The show starts after the most important decision has already been made. Original Sin, whatever else it does, shows you what the stakes of that decision actually were. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. The lie that accidentally told the truth. The NA meetings where Dexter gave the most honest speech of his life about the wrong thing. Lila, who understood him and used that understanding in the worst possible way. The Dark Passenger and what Harry said about it, which is probably the most precise the show ever gets, about externalization as a coping mechanism, Harry's code as harm reduction, not a fix but a structure for living with what couldn't be fixed, and the people, Rita, who was both perfectly equipped and perfectly vulnerable, Deb in the parking lot at 4 a.m, and then the shipping container working her way toward a treatment she didn't choose. Harrison at a party, impulsive and hurting, Hannah, who said, "That's just you, you're choosing this." And finally, the whole picture. what the show actually believes about compulsion, which is something it spent 8 seasons and multiple continuations demonstrating without quite announcing. What I keep coming back to, sitting with all of it, is how honest Dexter is about the limits of management. It doesn't present the code as a solution. It doesn't present Lila's dig deep and embrace it approach as liberation. It doesn't present abstinence or recovery as achievable or even necessarily desirable for this particular person. What it presents, with a consistency I find genuinely impressive, is the reality of living alongside something you didn't choose and cannot cure. The organization of it, the cost of that organization, the ripple effects that move outward through every relationship, however carefully you built the walls. And it does all of this while still making you root for Dexter. That's the trick the show pulls that I don't think it gets nearly enough credit for. You sit with Dexter's compulsion inside his voiceover, inside his meticulous rituals, and you find yourself hoping he gets away with it. Not because you agree with it, because the show has built a person who is genuinely trying, in his particular and catastrophic way, to live a life that has some shape to it. He loves his children, he loved Rita, he loves Deb. He is not a monster in the way we usually mean the word. He is someone who is carrying something that most of us never have to carry, and managing it in the only framework he was ever given. There are a few things I've been wanting to look at in future videos, and I'll mention them briefly because I think they connect to what we talked about tonight. There's a full examination of Dexter's relationship with Harry's ghost throughout the series. The internal conversation that functions almost as a therapy session he's never willing to complete. That's its own evening. And there's the Original Sin prequel, and what it does with young Dexter's formation, the moment before the code, which in some ways is the addiction origin story that the main series always implied but never quite showed. That'll be worth a proper look when we get there. But for tonight, we're done. We've spent a good long while with something that I think rewards the attention. A show that is more thoughtful about compulsion and management and the cost of proximity than it usually gets credit for. And we got to do it the way I like best, slowly, without rushing anywhere, sitting with the details until they gave us something back. I want to say one more thing before we sign off because it's been sitting with me across the whole evening. The question Dexter asks himself constantly, "Am I a monster?" is one that no one around him ever quite helps him answer. Harry gave him the code instead of an answer. Vogel gave him a clinical category instead of an answer. Lila used the question as a lever to get closer to him. Deb's answer changed depending on which season you caught her in. Hannah shrugged and told him the question was the wrong one to be asking. The NA meetings are interesting in this context because they're the only space Dexter ever occupies where the question gets asked in public. Not about him specifically, but in general. In every meeting room, someone is sitting with the version of that question that belongs to them. Something I did, something I couldn't stop, something I am, or something I was, and I'm not sure of the difference. Dexter sits in the back and thinks about knife sharpening and also falls asleep and dreams about his mother. He doesn't want to be in those rooms, but the rooms contain something real that he keeps bumping up against, which is other people in the active process of asking the same question from their own particular angle. He never finishes asking it himself. The show ends in the original run with a lumberjack in Oregon and a phone ringing and nothing resolved, and the question still open. New Blood gives it a violent conclusion that has its own logic. But the question, what am I? And is what I am something I chose? And is the thing doing this the same as the thing capable of love? That question is never answered. It's just asked again and again across many years of television and multiple continuations and one prequel in 100 different registers, always without resolution. And you don't spend all that time asking a question you already know the answer to. That's the most human thing about Dexter Morgan, not the killing, the not knowing. I think about the season 2 NA meeting sometimes, the room, the donuts, Caroline at the front sharing something true and hard while Dexter sits in the back, calculating knife sharpening intervals. And then, later, Dexter standing up and saying something true himself. Not the whole truth, never the whole truth, but the emotional truth underneath it. The darkness, the aliveness he feels inside it, the fear of connection, the wondering if anything else could love him. The room applauds. Lila watches from across the space. Dokes, later, will relax his suspicion. Rita will drive him to meetings. The cover story will hold for another season. And somewhere in all of that, in the middle of the fake recovery and the genuine compulsion and the people who love him for a version of himself that isn't quite complete, somewhere in there, Dexter Morgan is asking a real question inside a fiction. And the room, which has no idea what he actually is, hears something true enough to applaud. That's the whole show in one scene. That's what we spent tonight looking at. Something true, delivered at the wrong address, landing anyway. There's something comforting in that, I think. Not in the content of it. The content is dark in the specific way the show has always been dark, but in the fact of it. That even the most carefully maintained fiction, the most thoroughly constructed cover story, can't fully suppress the real thing underneath. The real thing surfaces. It finds its way into a room, it says something true, people hear it. Dexter couldn't recover, but he could still, occasionally, be honest, in the only language available to him, to people who didn't know what they were hearing, and they heard it anyway. Wherever you are tonight, I hope it's quiet and comfortable. I hope the ceiling fan is doing its thing. Sleep well. I'll see you next time.